Greetings and salutations! Welcome to the fourth episode of my quarantine-induced web series, Old T-Shirt Tuesday. Now, since July 4th was just this past weekend, it seemed appropriate that this should be my fourth episode. See what I did there? The American Revolution has been my favorite history subject since I was a kid. I grew up in Waltham, Massachusetts, about 5 miles from Lexington Green, the site where the first battle of the American Revolution began on April 19th, 1775. The year I was born, 1969, a new Broadway musical called 1776 opened. It was about the creation and signing of the Declaration of Independence. It was even made into an excellent film in 1972. Well, when I was a little kid, my oldest brother Eddie had the original Broadway cast album of the show. And from the first time I heard it, I was hooked. Soon after, my parents brought me to see a local high school production of the show. Unfortunately, I fell asleep. Hey, I was just a little kid, and it's a really long show, okay? Well, in 2004, I got the opportunity to be in a production of the show in Riverside, California. It was just such a joy to be in this production, to finally be inside the story. Over the years, my favorite musical number in the show had become Molasses to Rum. To me, it's the most dramatic number in the show, where the representative from South Carolina, Edward Rutledge, after having fingers pointed at him for being a slaveholder, suddenly points the finger back at his northern brethren because of their hypocrisy. After all, it was the northern ship merchants who sailed over to Africa, captured people, threw them in chains, dragged them across the Atlantic Ocean, and then sold them to the southern plantation owners. So their hands were not exactly clean in this whole thing. The way the production was staged, I spent most of my time, or at least a good portion of it, in the most upstage position, which gave me an amazing vantage point. I can watch the entire story unfold right in front of me, and it was easy to get emotionally caught up in it. More often than not, I found myself tearing up at the end of Molasses to Rum. Now, the real history that lays the background for that number is the fact that Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder himself, had written a pretty scathing passage into the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, which effectively called for the end of the slave trade. Now, as you can imagine, the Southern representatives resisted this, and so the finger-pointing began. But in order to get a unanimous vote on the question of independence, which they did need to have, the passage was eventually removed in order to get the Southerners to vote yes. Jefferson could have stood by his own words and released his own slaves anyway. However, being an extremely contradictory person and keeping his own financial interests in mind, he chose not to release his slaves. Personally, I've always admired John Adams the most among the founding fathers, and he's actually the central figure of the show. He was staunchly opposed to slavery, but even he capitulated when the South demanded the removal of the passage because he knew that with one no vote, his dream of American independence would die right then and there. There's a lot to admire about the Founding Fathers. Their intellect, the fact that they had the guts to declare independence when they had no reasonable expectation that they could even win the war. They put their lives on the line for the cause, even though they knew they'd be the first in line to be hanged for treason if it failed. The actual vote was taken in this room on July 2nd, 1775, but the full text of the Declaration was not made public until July 4th, which is why we celebrate Independence Day on the 4th. They were the architects of this new house that they were building, but unfortunately, they left the job unfinished. By putting off the slavery issue, they left a steaming pile of elephant dung right in the middle of the foundation, leaving it for future generations to try to clean up, which eventually led to the Civil War and the racial issues which still divide us today. We have tended to revere the Founding Fathers as demigods, but they really were just men. We can admire them for their accomplishments, but we should always temper that reverence with the idea that they were flawed human beings with their own biases and self-interests. Well, I guess we've gotten a little deep here. Wasn't this supposed to be about a t-shirt? At some point, either during or after our production of 1776, the producers gave us these lovely t-shirts as keepsakes. So right here in the front, you just have the name of the production, the theater company, the Performance Riverside. And then the back is where all the 1776 logo and stuff is. Several years ago, I spilled something on it. I don't think you can see it in the video. It was hot chocolate or something. It's pretty well faded, but around that time is when I stopped wearing it. Well, that's it. But before I go, I just want to say that everyone deserves the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that many, particularly people of color, have been denied these things for a very long time. So let's start a new American revolution based on equality and justice for all, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.